Allora, buongiorno a tutti. Se cominciamo questa seconda giornata del convegno su Giuseppe Torelli. Questa della mattina è una sessione dedicata a compositori che furono colleghi, diciamo così, di Torelli e che con lui condivisero l'esperienza bolognese e quella dell'Accademia Filarmonica. C'è stato un piccolo cambio di programma, per cui Piotr Wilk ha ceduto il posto a Marc Felicori e quindi cominciamo dalla sua relazione. Marc Felicori è belga di nascita, ma musicologo, violoncellista, ormai americano, italiano, insomma ha varie origini. Dal 1995 al 2022 ha vissuto negli Stati Uniti, dove è stato professore ordinario e titolare della cattedra di musicologia all'Università dell'Oregon. È ovviamente ancora invitato come professore ospite in vari conservatori europei, insegna violoncello barocco al Conservatorio di Bruxelles e ha pubblicato molti lavori sulla musica sacra a Bologna, su San Petronio, sulla storia e sul repertorio del violoncello tra 6 e 700. E ha anche una carriera solida di violoncellista e continuista e ha partecipato come esecutore ha registrato appunto diversi CD, soprattutto ovviamente musica antica e repertorio per violoncello. Stamattina ci presenta una relazione dal titolo Giovan Battista degli Antonii, Ricercate sopra il violoncello o Clavicembalo, solos or duets? E su questa domanda vi lascio.
Grazie Antonella, grazie a Piotr anche per avermi permesso di scambiare le nostre presentazioni, perché purtroppo dopo devo andare alla prova. Mi scuso anche in anticipo perché farò la relazione in inglese, tanto per saltare un passo nell'eventualità che si facciano gli atti, così già una prima stesura in inglese, ma parlerò lentamente, casomai. Allora, Giovanni Battista degli Antonii, the son of Giovanni and older brother of Pietro, was born in Bologna on 24 June 1636 and baptized a day later. He died in mid-January 1698. After studying with Giacomo Predieri, he succeeded his father as a trombone player in the Concerto Palatino in Bologna, beginning as a musico sopranumerario on 10 February 1650 and holding this post until 2 February 1675. He was also hired as a member of the Cappella Musicale San Petronio from June 1654 until Cazzati's reforms in December 1657. On the other hand, beginning in 1650, we already find the 14-year-old Giovanni Battista degli Antonii among the extra musicians hired for the large-scale festivities honoring the patron saint of Bologna and San Petronio on 3 and 4 October. In these documents from 1650 to 1652, he's mentioned as a cornetto player, whereas in 1653 he was paid 3 lire, though this time per l'organo secondo. However, Maurizio Cazzati, soon after his appointment as the new maestro di Cappella in San Petronio on 31 August 1657, decided to reform the Cappella both in structural, organizational terms and in terms of discipline. To achieve his goals, he obtained from the Fabriceria the authority to discharge all the musicians, excepting only the 2 organists, from their positions in the Cappella, and to audition performers based exclusively on their merits rather than on their family relations or friendships, as it used to be. Although the Cassatio Omniorum Musicorum was approved by the Vestry Board of the Basilica on 12 September 1657, followed by a Cassatio Musicorum Palazzi et Mansionarium a week later, both Degli Antonii brothers ceased to appear in the monthly payments in November 1657, and neither was listed in the Accetio Musicorum of 16 January 1658. So Degli Antonii only attempted to be hired again in San Petronio after Giovanni Paolo Colonna was elected Maestro di Cappella, and an organist's post was vacant in late December 1676. Unfortunately for him, the vote of the Vestry Board went against him this and instead Annibale Frabetti was hired as the second organist. During the year in which his brother Pietro was its principe, Giovanni Battista degli Antonii was elected to the Accademia Filarmonica on 27 June 1684 in the category of suonatori, as an organist, and of compositore. Oddly enough, he was never invited to provide any compositions for the annual celebration of the Accademia in San Giovanni in Monte, whereas Pietro's music was regularly performed there between 1670 and 1719. In his catalogo degli aggregati, Olivo Penna also notes that per le sue ottime qualità divenne organista delle due chiese di San Giovanni Maggiore, San Giacomo Maggiore e Confraternita di Santa Maria della Morte. Ebbe tanta vivacità d'ingegno e possesso di virtù musicali che insino agli anni giovanili diede a stampa alcune sue opere. Dopo fatti alcuni allievi fra i quali Pietro Giuseppe Sandoni, se ne morì l'anno 1698. Carlo Vitali dates degli Antoni's appointment as organist in Santa Maria della Morte in 1680, the year in which Pietro degli Antoni became maestro di cappella there, though only for a short period, and his selection in San Giacomo Maggiore in 1687. On the frontispiece of his Ricercate Opus 1 from 1687, the composer does indeed describe himself as organista di San Giacomo Maggiore, but he no longer mentions his position at the Arcomelo. However, the libro delle composizioni del convento di San Giacomo Maggiore, located in the Archivio di Stato of Bologna, contains an as yet unpublished document dated 14 September 1667, which could well be the date of degli Antoni's appointment to the position. Item, il medesimo padre priore propose ai padri capitolari se si contentavano a leggere per organista della nostra chiesa il signor Giovanni Battista degli Andrei, scritto così, musico di palazzo, quale si obbligava a fornire in tutte le feste, solennità e sabati dell'anno, con lo stipendio di 10. Degli Andrei is undoubtedly a scribal error, since no such name appears among the musicians of the Concerto Palatino. It is thus highly probable that the musico di palazzo, who became organist in San Giacomo in late 1667, was indeed degli Antoni. On the other hand, I have not found any other documents concerning the appointment of an organist in San Giacomo Maggiore in the last 3 decades of the 17th century. If degli Antoni was indeed hired as early as 1667 and remained organist in San Giacomo until his death in 1698, his salary of 15 lire was certainly not sufficient to live on. It is thus understandable that he kept his position as a trombone player at the Concerto Palatino as long as he could, and that he made 1 and perhaps 2 unsuccessful bids for the position of organist at San Petronio, which paid at least 25 lire. A number of circumstances emerged from this account, namely that degli Antoni was not rehired by Cazzati in 1658, then he was refused as an organist in San Petronio under Corona. He obtained both the short-lived position of organist in Santa Maria della Morte and the membership as an instrumentalist and composer at the Accademia Filarmonica when his brother Pietro was in charge. And he was one of the few composers of the Accademia whose music was never performed during the annual celebration of the Academy in San Giovanni in Monte. Taken all this together, this might suggest that he was not all that well regarded as a composer or performer in late 17th century Bologna. The only truly positive opinion of degli Antoni's otherwise fairly versatile profile as a musician is indeed Olivo Penna's account quoted earlier, several years after degli Antoni's death, however. Fantuzzi also calls him the dilettantissimo di musica. He was undoubtedly a professional musician. In modern secondary literature, degli Antoni is most often recorded as an important composer for the development of solo violoncello repertoire, as we will see later. However, this is probably a misinterpretation. Other than that, his compositions are best considered to be very graceful, as Torelli wrote, simple and pleasant to listen to, according to Vitali, or part of the important instrumental music production in late 17th century Bologna. His published output as a composer is also oddly limited to a very short period late in his career. He was 51 years old when his Ricercate Opus 1 appeared in 1687, and his last publication is dated 1696, his Opus 7, Versetti per Organo, 2 years before his death at age 62. In 1690, he published another volume of Ricercate a violino e violoncello o Clavicembalo as his Opus 5. The only other sources for compositions of Degli Antonii are two undated manuscripts in the Biblioteca Estense in Modena. After this bio-bibliographical summary of Degli Antonii, I will now discuss his Ricercate Opus 1. Only the Violoncello o Clavicembalo part has survived in print, including has survived, inducing Baroque cellists to perform them as solos. However, the existence of a violin part in a manuscript in the Biblioteca Estense in Modena could entirely change our perspective on these compositions. A little bit about the sources. The sources I study here are the violin part of manuscript MUSD 9 and the violoncello part published by Giuseppe Micheletti in Bologna as Ricercate sopra il Violoncello o Clavicembalo in 1687. The print is preserved in a single copy containing the Violoncello o Clavicembalo part at the Museo Internazionale Biblioteca della Musica under number V83. So here is the manuscript of the violin part that is found in the Estense in Modena, with the first part here of Ricercata prima, just the violin part, and then the cello part appears with a blank frontispiece, and the same Ricercata appears here. This being the print, the only copy that is left in print of this edition. Based on the type of errors transferred from the print into the manuscript B9 from Modena, and sometimes even certain corrections, it seems clear to me that the manuscript of the violoncello part is a copy from the print, not the other way around. And a few little examples. An example in measure 97 in Ricercata 7, which is not this one. For instance, a sharp in the print above the first C in a measure is located on the E in the staff, thus indicating a major chord in the continuum. However, since the C minor chord is impossible in this context, the sharp is redundant in that position and should have been located in front of the C, making it a C sharp. The similar situation, and basically that error in the print is copied in the manuscript. The same error also occurred in the Ricercata, the first Ricercata here, measure 54. To be sure, such an error is not in itself sufficient to prove that the manuscript is a copy of the print, but together with the fact that, for example, here in Ricercata ottava, measure 9, notes 3 and 5 in the cello part have a flat added, as you can see, by hand above the notes in print, and that they have been inserted in the manuscript copy, as we can see here, inserted in the music itself, to me seems like a fairly convincing proof of this hypothesis. And then small oversights and reading errors of the copies due to lack of clarity in the print are further proof of the fact, I think, that the manuscript was made from the print. So since no other source, print or manuscript, is available for the violin part, which was copied at the same time by the same hand as the cello part, we can exclude that the manuscript of either part predates the print. The only question, however, and it's quite an essential one, is whether the violin part was also copied, along with the violoncello part, from the lost print by Micheletti, or whether it was added later by another composer in an attempt to turn this unusual compositions for violoncello solo into quite common ricercati for violin and cello. In addition, the Modena manuscript, MUSD-10, in that manuscript the violin part to the first two ricercati only, but the writing seems to indicate a much later copy, maybe even of the late 18th century. Now, the question in my title, are there solos or duets, is what I want to address at this point. So ever since Francesco Battielli's famous 1913 article on the earliest literature for violoncello, the 12 ricercate of 1687 by Degli Antonii, have been considered the very first such collection of pieces for cello solo, even anticipating the 7 ricercati by Domenico Gabrielli, manuscript dated February 1689, and the 12 sonatas published in Parma in 1691 as the Trattenimento musicale sopra il violoncello da solo by Domenico Galli. However, the short pieces, mostly improvisatory style pieces or dances by Giuseppe Colombi and by Giovanni Battista Vitali, preserved in manuscript also at the estates in Modena, are most probably even older than the more developed ricercati and sonatas by Gabrielli and Galli. As far as we know, only a handful of scholars, including Adriano Cavicchi, Greg Barnett, Don Haran, and Marco Lombardi, are actually aware of the existence of the violin part to those 12 ricercati of Opus 1. But none have excluded the compositions from the repertoire for cello solo. In his presentation of the various hypotheses in a forthcoming article in Quadrivium, and I don't know if it has ever been published, but I was lucky to get a first trial of it. Marco Lombardi mainly opposes Don Juan's account of 1999 to my own that I already made in 1998, but is convinced that in the absence of further proof, all possibilities need to remain open. Haran states, and I quote him from his article, Degli Antonii concepì probabilmente queste composizioni come una sorta di duetto, con o senza supporto armonico. Non sappiamo quando decise di pubblicare la sola parte del basso, ma non è da escludere che abbia voluto sfruttare la nascente moda per il violoncello, mettendo rapidamente insieme, con poco sforzo, una raccolta per violoncello solo da presentare a Francesco II. In questo caso, la musica per violoncello solo avrebbe avuto inizio accidentalmente dall'eliminazione di una delle due parti della preesistente raccolta di duetti. La pubblicazione si presenta come esempio solo in apparenza autentico di musica per strumento solista. Tuttavia, come sappiamo, i ricercari di Degli Antonii possono essere suonati sia come duetti per violino che violoncello, con l'aggiunta ad libitum del continuo affidato a uno strumento a tastiera o allo stesso violoncello, sia come parte di violoncello eseguita da sola, realizzando o meno il continuo previsto, sia come parte di violoncello accompagnato da uno strumento a tastiera, sia, infine, come parti per tastiera eseguita da sola, realizzando o meno il continuo previsto. E ci sono delle registrazioni che seguono proprio quest'idea. Logically, a manuscript must have predated the publication, but that manuscript has not yet come to light, and it may never do so. However, I would be surprised if a composer had written two-part ricercati only to have them published and performed by one of the two instruments, thus leaving out an important part of the polyphonic texture. Particularly since no mention of any ad libitum performance practice appears in the print. Moreover, a performance on harpsichord alone would at least imply that figures would be present in more than just the 7 of the 12 ricercati that have them. On cello too, one could play a harmonized version, but only in the presence of the violin part, since certain chords would not make sense when taken out of their context. Although it's clear to me that the composer has created his 12 pieces starting from the bass line, and that the violin part was conceived subsequently. So here in the Ricercate 12, some mentioned here, I do not think that all of the pieces can work actually without the violin. Some of the Ricercate are mainly continuous bass figures in eighth notes, with repeated pitches or cadential figures typical of late 17th century continual parts, making a solo performance of them on cello a bit cold. Imagine the cellist decides to play the continual line of Torelli's Opus 5 because the violin part has been lost and claiming that this is a solo cello piece. So we're a bit at that kind of level. Other pieces such as the Ricercate Ottava, come back to this in a minute, are less ungainly when played on cello alone. There is actually a recording that goes back to the 80s by Arcomelo, who plays the 8th Ricercate. But passages in soprano and treble clef, reaching up to high C in treble clef, and quite often using the range between high D and high A on the upper string, were not yet parts of what the bass of the violin family was able to do technically, at least at the time. All the notes in the Ricercate could actually be played only if we accept that performers used a smallish, typical Baroque violoncello, 5-stringed instruments, most probably tuned like a regular cello, C, G, D, A, with an upper D string, otherwise the instrument is too small, and actually the E string is not useful here and would cause some problems, organologically speaking. So definitely not the larger violone size, as several Italian violinists / cellists such as Giovanni and his brother Antonio Maria Bononcini used to play. To my mind, the various clef changes imply that the continual player, in the case of the harpsichordist, used them as new incipits to obbligato motifs or melody / voices within the polyphonic texture. I also find it implausible that the former trombone and cornetto player and the organist of a lesser church in Bologna would anticipate in dedicating these compositions to Francesco II d'Este a repertoire for cello solo, not his own instrument by the way, which was just about to begin at the Modenese court with pieces for violone of Brommi, Vitali, and more importantly, with those for violoncello by Gabrielli, Galli, Borri, Iachini, Bononcini, Laurenti, and so forth. In short, I don't think that the Ricercate are for violoncello solo, since there is no reason, no motive for Degli Antonii to have produced such works for that specific instrument. Opus 5 is this other collection of Ricercate, and they are for violin and cello. Moreover, the genre of sonata da camera or Ricercate for these two instruments, with the possible but not preferred alternative of using a keyboard instrument instead of the cello, was quite widespread in that period. So here I have a list of composers with their works who actually published such compositions. And it goes on, so these are just a couple of slides with a few names listed. And then the indication violoncello o cembalo, one or the other, was absolutely common in Italian secular sonatas until at least the second or third decade of the 18th century. On the other hand, however, I admit that it is unusual for a composer and misleading to us not to indicate both instruments on each of the part books, but only Ricercate sopra il violoncello and the cello part, and Ricercate sopra il violino and the violin part. Moreover, nowhere in his dedication text does Degli Antonii mention anything unusual, that is, that this collection contains the first printed pieces for cello, about the composition he presents as questi miei armonici studi, harmonic works indeed, automatically implying more than one voice. Even though the violin part seems to have been conceived musically after the bass part, as an organist and continual player would probably have done, I don't think that there are convincing reasons to believe that this specific violin part was written later, maybe by another composer, because the original was lost. Compositional style is indeed a bit clumsy, and the musical text is certainly not devoid of contrapuntal errors, including parallel fifths, cross relations, odd harmonic progressions, and artificial, almost odd scoring, particularly when the cello part is most appealing, but there are elements that we find in many compositions of the period So if we briefly compare Degli Antonii's Opus 1 with his Ricercate, Opus 5, published in 1690, also by Micheletti in Bologna, we find that, as it was the case with Opus 1, the 10 Ricercate are published in 2 part books, one for violino and one for violoncello or clavicembalo, though this time the complete title appears in both part books, avoiding any confusion. Looking at the violoncello part, the writing is very similar to that of Opus 1. I've played them as if they were solos, and it worked just as well, or for that matter, just as poorly, as playing the cello part of Opus 1 by itself. Only the Ricercata prima has indications for the continuo player, although they're limited to indicate whether chords are major or minor. The others are left to the skill of the improvising continuo player. However, it seems that the Antonii prefers the bass part to be performed by the violoncello, since he mentions that instrument first. Conversely, in his balletti e correnti gigli e sarabande da camera, his Opus 3 of 1688, he mentions on the title page of the score a violino e clavicembalo o violoncello, thus expressing his preference for the harpsichord as an accompanying instrument in this case. Technically, the violoncello part of Opus 5 is slightly less demanding. The highest note is a B in the Ricercata quarta, but most pieces use quick alternations between bass, tenor, and alto clef. In Opus 1, he also exceptionally uses soprano and treble clef. In short, the cello part of Opus 5 is quite comparable to that of Opus 1, and the range also preferably requires a 5-string cello, since the technical demands are literally higher than music written by professional cellists in Emilia in this period. Interestingly, the violin part of Opus 5 shows the exact same characteristics and oddities as in Opus 1, and the counterpoint is at times clumsy in the same way as it is in the earlier collection. After studying the Ricercate Opus 5 and comparing them to Opus 1, I'm in no doubt that Degli Antonii is also the composer of the violin part of Opus 1 that is extant in manuscript. So in conclusion, Degli Antonii's career has clearly shown that he may not have been the most able of musicians or composers, ample proof of which we find in this 1st and 5th printed collection. I consequently adhere to what Marco Lombardi justly calls a lectio facilior, in simply accepting that the printed violin part, the only extant copy preserved in Bologna, has been lost, and that the only source we have for the violin part is the manuscript that I actually published in a facsimile with the unfortunately defunct Forni editions in 2006. The only historically acceptable way to perform the Ricercate by Degli Antonii, in my opinion, is thus with violin and violoncello or harpsichord for the bass part, as is clearly stated in the frontispiece of the extant printed violoncello part. Thank you.
Grazie davvero Marco per questa immersione nella carriera. C'è un simbolo strano, mi sentite? Se sono un po' più distante. E per questo affresco, diciamo, sulla carriera, sulla biografia, sulle varie questioni biografiche che hanno riguardato appunto le musiche, le stampe, hai parlato di tante cose e credo che gli spunti possono essere tanti. Non so se poi qui in sala ci sono violoncellisti, visto che siamo in un conservatorio, magari possono avere un'opinione su questo, e comunque qualsiasi tipo di intervento ovviamente ben accetto. Quindi lascio la parola al pubblico, che ancora un po'. Prego, Simone Lagana.
Forse non ho capito bene, però la mia domanda è: perché c'è scritto sul frontispizio Ricercate per il violoncello e non Ricercate e basta? Forse non ho capito bene.
Sì, no, ho menzionato che questa è una cosa un po' strana, infatti, perché di solito anche nell'opera quinta mette violino e violoncello. Adesso è stato, se mi l'argomento contra, ma non penso che sia abbastanza decisivo.
About the terms violoncello or clavicembalo, it reminds me, of course, of Torelli Opus 5, violone or clavicembalo, and also the fact that often it's, for instance, by Vivaldi, it's written the first page, organo, and later in the music it's written clavicembalo. And the question would be, is that word o, ovvero, to be taken literally, or would you consider the possibility of having played the continuo by violoncello and harpsichord?
Yes, of course. I think this is never to be taken completely literally, even if you think of Torelli's Opus 5, violone or clavicembalo. I think it is sort of a minimal indication. So, in order to make this music work, you have to have a cello or a harpsichord at least. And then the first indication we find of the idea of having violoncello and clavicembalo at all times together in the continuo is Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, where he mentions in the last 30 years it has become the common thing for continuos to be played by those two instruments. And so we can very well imagine that before that people worked with what they have, and this is never to be taken. And also from Torelli's indications too in the execution of his Opus 6 or Opus 8, he clearly mentions, you know, if you have a big venue, just double the parts, have more instruments. So there is definitely much more flexibility than we tend to think today by taking these frontispieces completely literally.
But would you consider Torelli Opus 4, violin and cello or viola bastarda, viola?
Violoncello, I think this re-enters in that same tradition. They're of course, they're Torelli's works, they're a lot better than Degli Antoni's, but they're the same kind of sort of almost didactic or pedagogical contrapuntal duets. Here, of course, in the Opus 4, he calls them concertini da camera. I think he continues that pedagogical literature and gives it a better cachet, but also at the same time continuing that literature of balletti and so forth for violin and cello, which we have so many examples, by Piazza, Martini. I think, yeah, these are pieces that are better played, I think, with just two parts. And if the cellist has the skills of harmonizing them, then that's up to the cellist. But I would not necessarily put a harpsichord in there, since Torelli doesn't mention it. If he wants it, he does usually mention it. So I think even though these indications are not completely to be taken literally, when they exclude certain instruments, I think that's an important thing to sort of at least keep in mind when we perform these pieces. And the Opus 4 is really two parts with no mention of any chord instrument. There's not even a trace of a figure, a continual figure in there either. So that's what I think. If you have other ideas, I'd be happy to hear them.
Thank you very much.
Siamo un po' in ritardo, ma ho una curiosità che non posso, visto che sei un esperto appunto di Pietro degli Antonii, e hai fatto un quadro completo, no, della sua biografia, diciamo che appunto ha avuto successo molto tardi, ha avuto una carriera che non è stata così lineare. Ti sei fatto un'idea del perché, anche comparando lo stile degli Antonii con altri compositori della sua cerchia che nello stesso periodo, perché il suo stile non era così apprezzato, e soprattutto come mai si esibisce in opera 1 con una raccolta così, invece di magari una più comune raccolta di sonate, come opera di solito?
Infatti, sì, bella domanda quella. Di solito uno esordisce con qualcosa per far vedere il contrappunto che può fare a 25 anni quando arriva all'età maggiore. Sì, arrivare a 51 anni con questi duetti mi è sempre stato un po' strano, e per quello che ho cercato di fare un po' un parallelo con la vita anche del fratello, che ovviamente è un grandissimo musicista, che arriva o che ottiene stranamente se il fratellino ha un posto di rilievo, il fratellone riesce a farsi conoscere un pochino, quindi vive un po' nell'ombra del fratellino e penso che senza le posizioni di importanza che ha avuto Pietro, giovane battista, rimaneva trombonista a un certo paradiso, un po'. È per quello che ho fatto un po' questo parallelo, cercare di capire come mai ha cominciato così tardi,